So my very first day in the Peace Corps service, in my small rural village in Mukubilo, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the nation of Botswana, I walked up to my very first village meeting, showed up as the only white woman and the only American this village had ever seen. I stepped up to the entrance of the large shaded area in the plaza where we were going to have our first town meeting and saw immediately that all of the men were sitting on one side in chairs and all of the women were sitting on the other side in the dirt. I stood there looking at everyone as they looked back at me, all of us frozen. No one was sure what to do with me, including myself. After a moment of whispers among the villagers, one of the men decided the most appropriate thing to do was to stand up and offer me a chair. I glanced back at the crowd, and that moment I knew I had to make a big decision. Only a few months earlier, I was a young college graduate at UC Berkeley, where I was the president of the Women's Honor Society, the chapter leader for the National Organization for Women, and every feminist bone in my body absolutely wanted to go sit in that chair. Women could have chairs too. But what would it mean for me, this outsider, this foreigner, to come into their village and have my first act on my first day be sitting in that chair? An act so contrary to their beliefs and their customs, how would I be received? So as I stood staring down at the chair in front of me and all of the eyes of the village staring back up at me, I thought of the 3 goals of the Peace Corps and the mission I was there to serve. In Peace Corps, we have 3 goals. The first goal is to help countries interested in meeting their need for trained volunteers, and that was us. I was dispatched by the United States government in 2006 as a Peace Corps volunteer serving as a social worker to take care of children born with HIV whose parents had died of AIDS. The second goal is to help promote a better understanding of Americans on behalf of foreign cultures. And since I was one of the very few Americans this village in Mukubilo had ever seen, I knew this first meeting in this village had a lot riding on it. I knew my mission to help prevent HIV and AIDS had a lot riding on it. And I wondered how they might feel if I sat in that chair as a woman. So I decided to politely thank the gentleman who'd offered me the chair, walked past him, lowered myself into the dirt, and I sat on the ground with the other women. And it turns out that was the best decision I ever made, because that's where all the gossip was. You could hear who was marrying who had gotten so-and-so pregnant, what was happening in the village, and I was very, very glad to sit there and gossip away from the men. But more importantly, after a year and a half of my 2.5-year Peace Corps service and sitting in the dirt at every meeting, I got the courage to ask the village chief if we could have a gender equality workshop in our village. And after 2 years, or a year and a half of me sitting in the dirt, he said yes. And so we did. Even though I was learning Setswana, we recruited a Setswana-speaking nurse to hold a 2-day workshop where both men and women came. And we were learning about why so many men would blame the women in their lives for, quote, bringing HIV into the family. You see, women had few rights and little economic security in Botswana outside their husbands. And so often, it was the women who were receiving HIV from their husbands who had slept with someone outside the marriage. However, men never go to the doctor. And so when women would get pregnant, the very first thing they would do to get for prenatal testing is test for HIV, because we were trying to prevent mother-to-child transmission. And they would have to go back home and say, I am HIV positive. And their husbands would ruin their lives. They would divorce them, kick them out of their homes, take everything from them, take their property. And so I knew what it meant to explain to men why women should not be the only ones testing for HIV in this village. And so as we sat in this bungalow in the gender equality workshop, we realized the conversations between men and women, they realized what they had done to each other. So we encouraged both men and women to get tested regularly, to use precautions like condoms, and for the first time, I could see change in this village. But I never, ever would have been able to pull that off had I not had the patience and kindness and resilience to put my own beliefs aside and sit in the dirt for a year and a half. So now back home in California, I'm always striving for what we in the Peace Corps community call the third goal of Peace Corps. Remember, there are 3 goals. And that third goal is helping Americans learn about foreign cultures and learn about how the Peace Corps transformed us. And so just like I did with the gender equality workshop all those years ago, I have fought hard for the causes I believe in. And I strongly believe that all people deserve the freedom to be who they want to be in our country, no matter who you are. But just recently, I had an interaction back home here in my own country where my beliefs were challenged, just like they were all those days ago in my rural village in Mukabilo. You see, I believe so much in the causes that I fought for, including gender equality, that I decided to come home and run for office in 2020. And I had a very long and heated campaign against 4 men. I was the only woman in the race, and I've heard these men calling me the, quote, little girl running for office. Well, guess what? This little girl kicked their butts. I won. And I have recently decided to run for higher office up in Sacramento to be our next state senator. And I'm excited. But I had an endorsement meeting coming up 2 weeks ago where I very much felt like I was walking into my first meeting in the village in Botswana. You see, one of my opponents in this race is going to be a 25-year retired sheriff. And my campaign consultant called me and said, you need to get law enforcement vote. You know what you have to do. So I was invited by our San Diego Police Officers Association to go to their union board meeting and present my case. But the day that I was going to go was International Women's Day, a few Saturdays ago. And the campaign consultant called me and said, Marni, don't do what you did last year. Don't, bring up the woman issue again. What the campaign consultant meant by the, quote, woman issue is that on this particular board of law enforcement personnel in the city of San Diego, there isn't a single woman. I remember being the only woman in the room last year when I went before this board, and all of these large, strong, stern-looking police officers stared back at me. And I worked up the courage to ask them, hey, out of the nearly 2,000 law enforcement officers in the city, why aren't there any women in leadership on your board? Well, I heard all the excuses afterwards. I heard an earful, and I heard that the men were not happy that I brought that question up. So this year, a few weeks ago, as I was preparing to walk into that boardroom, I remembered for a moment what it felt like to stand there on the dirt in the edge of my village for the very first meeting, and I had to decide whether to sit in that chair with the men or sit in the dirt. So I took a deep breath and I placed my hand on the door handle to walk inside, and I realized, Marni, you have been sitting in the dirt with these men. For the past 4 years I've been on the city council, I took the leadership on making sure that our public safety has what they need to do their jobs professionally. I've gone on ride-alongs, I've understood de-escalation tactics, I've made sure gun violence restraining orders are served on time, every time. And at that moment, I walked into the room and saw that long table of men that were going to be grilling me for the next hour, questioning me, deciding whether to help with my political future. And I thought, I've sat in the dirt long enough. But as soon as I walked in and sat down in the hot seat, ready, full of rage to make my voice heard, I remembered the third goal of the Peace Corps. And I remembered what I learned there, that at the end of the day, service is not about me. Our Peace Corps service was not about us. It's about service and helping others. And so instead of my self-righteous demands I was going to make and ask about women's equality, I decided instead to share a story. I sat there, and the campaign consultant looked at me, and I looked at him as they said, we're wrapping up. Any other questions? And I said, yes, I have one more thing. And he shook his head, and I said, yes. And I said, guys, you may not have heard, but the district attorney of Jackson, Mississippi was recently indicted. And half of them were on their phones or typing on their computers and looked up and said, Jackson, Mississippi? I said, yeah. You know that I used to be a lawyer before I ran for office. I was a deputy city attorney. And, I used to work in Mississippi. Because after I returned from the Peace Corps, I wanted to help people with HIV and AIDS in my own country, and it turns out HIV and AIDS is spreading like wildfire in the Deep South because of poverty and lack of access to health care and discrimination. And I graduated at the top of my class at law school. I was an editor on the Law Review and National Moot Court winner. And when I went to sit down with for my job interview for the district attorney of Jackson, Mississippi, he sat there across the table, and halfway through the interview, he grabbed my hand and started rubbing it and asked me what my guilty pleasures were. He asked me what I do on the weekends. This man started calling me every Saturday night after that job interview, and at one point asked me to come to a hotel room with him as part of my job process. I left Mississippi because of sexual harassment, and at this point, you could hear a pin drop in that boardroom. All of these officers had their attention on me. I said, when I ran for office, I thought this job would shield me from sexual harassment. It has not. Mayors in small towns around San Diego County have texted me how much they love how I look in this dress, or told me how much they're lusting after me. And I said, I guarantee you, I know some of you have recently had daughters in your family. You will not know this about your daughters. I have never told my dad this. I don't want my daddy to know this about his little girl. And so the reason that I'm asking all of you officers here why there are no women in leadership on this board is not because I need a quota or affirmative action. It's because in law enforcement, there's ways I need to be protected and feel safe that you could never understand. This is a public safety issue for me. And so afterwards, I stood up, and all of those big burly officers, one by one, came over to shake my hand, and two of them whispered, "Thank you for sharing your story." So I don't know yet whether they will support me for my Senate race, but I do know I feel very good about using my voice to once again make change. And it's a lesson I learned sitting in the dirt all those years ago in the Peace Corps.